Rabbi Cohn.
Great, thanks. So I'd like to begin tonight with a few moments of silence in whatever way you normally would be meditating, just so that we can all come together, like start from a place of meditation and silence. So if you would, just a few moments. I'd like to begin with a question about your current meditation practice. So how many of you, this is just to really demonstrate, I think, the variety of practices, how many of you use a breath practice where you watch your breath? Most of you. How many of you use a mantra? So it's either breath or mantra, sort of depending.
Both?
Both? Okay, good. Vipassana, insight meditation. Metta, loving kindness meditation. Zen, just sitting. Centering prayer. Centering prayer is a Christian form of meditation that is actually like using a mantra, similar to using a mantra, but less like insistent on staying with the word. Anyways, what this shows is a great variety of types of meditation around a generic human endeavor. Right? So we know that, but I just wanted to point that out as I begin talking about meditation in the Jewish tradition. First, what I'm going to do is give you some history, and then talk about contemporary Jewish meditation. And then, this was actually a Tucker's request, that there's some curiosity about how it is that so many Jews end up being drawn to Buddhism. And I have some thoughts about that, so I would share those with you, and then hopefully some time at the end for questions. I'm more accustomed to teaching in a dialogue like back and forth than just a frontal presentation. But I think this calls for a frontal presentation for right now, but then maybe we can have some time, I hope we have some time for questions and dialogue. So, the thing to say about the history, Jewish meditation historically, and by historic, I get to say all the way back to biblical times, is that meditation seems to be mostly used for ecstatic purposes and esoteric purposes, to achieve ecstatic altered states. The first allusion or reference, perhaps to meditation, comes from the book of Genesis, as a matter of fact. We read in Genesis about Isaac, Abraham's son, that Isaac went out and did something in the field right before his wife Rebecca shows up. And the question is, what did he do? The verb is lasuach. It's a Hebrew word that's not used anywhere else in all of scriptures. So what was he doing, lasuach? It is taken by some people to mean that he was meditating. It's understood to mean that he was meditating. Contemporary meaning of that word is to walk or to stroll. And you would think maybe he was strolling in the field, but I prefer to think that he was having a contemplative, like a walking meditation in the field. Anyway, that's how it is read by contemporary Jews who are interested in the origins of Jewish meditation. But the next biblical reference is a biggie, and it's not even like there's a question about it. So it has to do with Ezekiel. You know Ezekiel? Some of you know Ezekiel. Ezekiel has a vision. This is in the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel. And it's a vision of what's called the divine chariot. So first Ezekiel describes these four creatures. They have three sets of wings, four sets of wings, wheels within wheels. It's a very mysterious vision that he has. And then he says about these creatures, above the expanse over their heads was the semblance of a throne, in appearance like sapphire. And on top, upon this semblance of a throne, notice it's not a throne, but like a semblance of a throne, there was the semblance of a human form. There was a radiance all about him, like the appearance of the rainbow, which shines in the clouds on a day of rain. Such was the appearance of the surrounding radiance. That was the appearance of the semblance of the glory or the presence of God. So Ezekiel has had some kind of major vision. And this becomes the basis of much of Jewish esoteric, ecstatic mysticism. It's called Ma'aseh Merkavah, the deeds or the doings of the chariot. So he sees like some kind of chariot. It's not clear exactly what he sees, this throne. And there's a hint that this was already resonant in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which there's one scroll that seems to be pointing to this. I mean, the book of Ezekiel is from several hundred years before the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we're talking around the time of the turn of the Common Era, around the time that Jesus lived. So first I quote from the Torah, from the book of Genesis, maybe 500 before the Common Era, then Ezekiel, or maybe around the same time, which is picked up by the Dead Sea Scrolls around the time of Jesus, and becomes the focus of, as I say, of esoteric, contemplative, we assume, Judaism. So the Talmud, which was redacted in the year 500 or so of the Common Era, so we've just spanned 1,000 years. But just, we're doing a little quick tour. Because there's nothing explicitly written until we get to the Talmud, which only then has hints. The Talmud is a great compendium of rabbinic wisdom and Jewish law. And when it sits on a bookshelf, it's about this law. It's a lot. Yeah, it would take up like one of these shelves. So just to give you a sense of it, and it only hints that there's a mystical, esoteric, and perhaps contemplative. I use that word like meditation, contemplative tradition going on that they don't want to talk about publicly. Gershom Scholem, who was a 20th century scholar of Jewish mysticism, writes this. He says about the Talmud that the Talmud speaks of ecstatic contemplation. That's one of our words, right? Ecstatic contemplation of the Merkavah, of the chariot, experienced as an ascent to heaven. And here's what's so interesting. It's called, in the rabbinic language, the descent to the Merkavah. On the one hand, they're envisioning ascending through the 7 palaces or 7 layers towards God, and that's the imagery. Teresa of Avila talks about the palace. It's that same image of ascending through stages towards God. But the rabbis, as they're talking about this ascent, call it the descent. Now, what does that tell you? Where are you descending to? It's an inner descent, right? I mean, that's our experience, I think, often in meditation. So this is just another hint that the rabbis knew about contemplation, about meditation. There's another story that comes from the same time. It's actually a little older, a rabbinic story. And this will be my last reference to the rabbinic period, which ends around the 6th or 7th century of the Common Era. The story is of the 4 who entered Pardes, or paradise. What is paradise? They don't say. One looked and died. One looked and went mad. One looked and cut the shoots. And that image is to suggest that that third rabbi became an apostate. He left Judaism. And then the text says, only Akiva entered in peace and left in peace. Some say ascended in peace and left in peace. And so there's this hint that this was dangerous stuff. You could go mad, you could die, you could just completely lose your connection to Judaism, to who you are. Or if you were centered enough, and you all know this also, if you were centered enough, grounded enough, whole enough, you could, because peace and wholeness are the very similar words in Hebrew, you could enter in peace and leave in peace. You could have this ecstatic experience and return from it whole. Okay, so this is like early hints of meditation as part of Jewish history, Jewish esoteric history. And then in the Middle Ages, quick step forward into around the 13th century, the 1200s, Rumi is writing then. Christian mysticism is, although it's already existed, is beginning to flourish in ways that are still studied and revered until this day. And what were the Jews doing? We were not writing. We were not keeping journals. We were not writing poetry. No, it remained an esoteric and secret tradition that was only taught 1-to-1, 1-to-2. But it's clear that it was meditation. So, for example, the best report we have of this is a teacher, a rabbi named Abu Lafia, who lived in the 13th century in Spain. And he wrote about his practice, which was to take Hebrew letters and to manipulate them mentally. Particularly the letters that made up the various mystical, esoteric names of God. There are many names for God, and some of which we don't even say because they're so esoteric. And so he combined Hebrew letters. Like, you take 4 letters and you flip 1 and then you flip 2 and then you flip 3 and then you go backwards like that. And if you do that, this is a form of meditation. If any of you have done an intense concentration, focused meditation, that's all there is. The rest of the world falls away. He also wrote about using music, meditations on colors, on repetition of the divine name, which would be like a mantra, actually, and breath meditations. Sitting with his head between, this was somebody else that these Kabbalists did, sitting with their head between their knees and having, I don't know what, mental things. Pretty soon you're in an altered state, right? It's a form, this is the best I can do in terms of telling you the history of Jewish meditation, because besides this, nothing's written. It remained, as I keep saying, underground, secret, and esoteric in the sense that it was not publicized publicly. But one thing to mention is that the Kabbalah uses the term contemplation and the term meditation as the same. And again, just to make a reference, in Christian mysticism, or in Christian spirituality, those two words mean something different. Contemplation and meditation have different meanings. Just for those of you who might know that. In Jewish teaching, it's the same, and it's what we would agree is meditation in all of its various forms. Okay, so moving forward a couple of more centuries to the Hasidic tradition. The Hasidic tradition, which began in the mid-1700s and flourished for maybe 100 years or so, and then diminished somewhat for a variety of reasons, but was completely wiped out, almost completely wiped out by World War II and the devastation of the Jewish community in Eastern Europe. But the Hasidic tradition popularized these kind of altered states that come through repetition, through music, through dancing. You think of the whirling dervishes. I mean, that's a meditative practice. Let's see. Yeah, I'm doing good. I have a little timeline. I'm okay. So I'll share this story with you. I have heard about this somewhat ecstatic Hasidic dancing, but I had never seen it until I spent a year in Israel, in Jerusalem. And one night, coming home from a Shabbat dinner, late, like 2 o'clock in the morning, in Mea Shearim, which is an ultra-Orthodox area of town. Totally safe. I was walking with my roommate, but we were totally safe. There were people walking there, baby carriages, people on the street, well lit. I mean, it was amazing to feel so free in the middle of the night. And we walked by just a very plain building where we could see that there were men dancing around a table, maybe not quite as big as this, but something like that. With, we could see in the windows the shadows of these men. It was like a stereotype. It was like Fiddler on the Roof. I mean, but it was real. I saw it. And they were just like arm in arm dancing around the table at 2 o'clock in the morning, like doing that. And I thought, these guys are having an experience. Clearly, they've been at it for a while. So this whole, what I've been describing during this 18th and 19th century and until this day really came out of being this esoteric secret teacher to student experience and became really available to the men, but back then. But anyway, available to like the ordinary folks. All right. Some background about Jewish meditation. Any questions? I'll pause for a moment.
Where or when did you learn it?
We'll get to that. Yeah, thank you for asking. I actually am going to weave that in now as I talk about contemporary Jewish meditation. I'll just answer that now. So, I was telling Tucker that I was ordained almost 18 years ago. The anniversary comes up next month. So I was in the computer field before that for many years, and so I wasn't really involved in Jewish life particularly, or any spiritual life. But a friend of mine discovered TM, and she said, "Try it, you'll like it." It was 1978. So that was my first introduction in 1978 to meditation. How many of you did TM at some point? A couple of you. Yeah. And that was a mantra-based system, and that's what really got me started meditating. And I did for some years. I can't remember now for how long. I mean, for a while. I really had a practice, and that kind of diminished. And then when I was in rabbinic school, in around the early 1990s, and I can't remember exactly why, but I returned to meditating. It turned out to be very helpful while I was in rabbinic school, because, like being in any graduate school is fairly intense. And then I went to a Jewish meditation retreat in like about 1998 or so. So that would have been 20 years after TM. Again, a different friend, said there's going to be this Jewish meditation retreat. And I thought, I don't know what that is, but that sounds good. So she and I went, and it was taught by a rabbi in the renewal movement by the name of David Cooper. It was maybe a 7-day retreat. Do you know him? And by the end of the retreat, I thought, I want to teach meditation. Mm-hmm. It was like, this happens to me. Sometimes I get just a really clear sense of what's next for me. And it was one of those, I want to do that. Mm-hmm. I can do that. I really felt it. Because by then I had returned to meditation for 4 or 5 years. So I had an established practice. I don't remember what it was, but it was established. You know what I mean? Maybe it was breath. I don't remember. And so one thing led to another, and I have taught meditation. And I here in San Francisco, where I used to be a rabbi, and now here. So that's my background. Because the other thing to say is that I have sat at Spirit Rock, which is a mindfulness meditation retreat center in Northern California. I sat at the San Francisco Zen Center, and I sit at the Zen Center here also. More about that I'll say. Oh, and I've also done some work with centering prayer. So here's the thing about contemporary Jewish meditation. It reflects, I assert, a wider cultural shift that we've all experienced towards personal spirituality. This is like post-World War II, and probably starting in the 60s. A shift in this country's culture towards more personal experience of spirituality, however we each define that. and towards an interest in things of the East. I think of the Beatles, going to India. So, and how Zen and meditation in general, which comes from the East, has become very attractive to us. I also want to say that I'm speaking about liberal Jews and not Orthodox Jews. Everything I say from now on does not apply to the Orthodox community, about which I only know as an outsider. So, but speaking of the liberal Jewish community, from the conservative movement all the way to secular humanists, I think what I'm saying more or less applies. Okay. There is a tension in Jewish history between these two things, between borrowing from the wider culture and yet keeping it ours, and from being absorbed into the wider culture. So, Hanukkah bush. Like the pressure from the external culture, from the secular culture, sometimes overwhelms us. I'm not in favor of Hanukkah bushes, I have to say. I mean, we have our own traditions, and we have Hanukkah. Like, we don't need a bush to pretend and decorate. So that tension is always there, and the tension shows up here, I think, in terms of meditation. That is, both in the Zen tradition, and am I right to say the Tibetan tradition of meditation, the more Buddhist I hope I'm not on dangerous ground here, but like Vipassana and Metta and Zen all come from the East, and the question is, are we, let's see if I wrote that down. Let me see if I wrote this. It was a great expression. Yes. Are we borrowing or are we rediscovering? I think that's just a really good, I think for all of us, to are we borrowing from the wider culture, or are we rediscovering something that was ours all along? In this case, I think it's probably a little bit of both, because it was not ours so strongly as it was in the East. It was really not known to us as Jews. So what makes Jewish meditation Jewish? Most Jewish meditation teachers that I know about make a real effort to make it sound Jewish, to make it Jewish. I mean, right? Because otherwise it's just this generic, let's just sit with our eyes closed in a comfortable position and watch our breath, which is fine. So, but there are these Jews who want, like, me too, I want to do it too, but I want it to be part of my Jewish life, my Jewish spirituality. So, okay, good. So let's close our eyes and watch our breath and say shalom instead of om. Breathe in on sha and out on lom. People teach this. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. I'm just giving you as an example. One teacher who wrote a book about Jewish meditation, which is really good. It's a very nice introduction to Jewish meditation, says in her introduction, Jewish meditation uses images, words, and symbols that come from the Jewish tradition. That's what makes it Jewish. It uses images, words, and symbols that come from the Jewish tradition. So we do a generic meditation, and then we use Jewish words and symbols. So, for example, the Shema with our breath. That's a breath meditation. We just stay with the breath, Shema. So great mantra meditation. You can use any word, obviously. A friend of mine who's been ill has started meditating as a way of just kind of calming himself and just centering himself as he's gone through various treatments, and he has started using Hineni as his mantra. Hineni is a Hebrew word that means, here I am. So, those of you who know about the binding of Isaac, the story of Abraham taking Isaac up on the mountain to offer him as an offering, God calls that story starts with God calling to Abraham, Avraham, and Abraham says, Hineni, which is interpreted to mean, I am fully present. It's not like, yo, or here I am, or present, or something. It's like, I am fully present. Hineni, here I am. That's often how it's translated. Here I am. So as a meditation, especially, that would be a really excellent mantra meditation. It's very Jewish. It has resonances. Abraham's not the only one who says Hineni. Moses says Hineni. I don't know. It's used regularly in the Hebrew scriptures and in modern. Yeah, Cantor on the evening of Yom Kippur has a chant that he starts with that begins Hineni, which means the same thing. Here I am, and it's meant to focus him, since Cantor carries the weight of the high holiday service, and particularly Yom Kippur. It's his way of saying, okay, here I am, prepared to carry the weight of the entire congregation. Hineni. A phrase, so I'm talking about different ways that Jews have in the last 20 or 30 years incorporated meditation into our spiritual practice. Another generic type of meditation is to repeat a phrase. Yeah, so I don't know in other traditions. I know in the Christian tradition there's like the Jesus prayer, for example, that some people use. Is that what it's called? Do any of you know? Anyway, there's certain phrases. We often will draw on the Psalms. I mean, you all can. They belong to everybody, but we often turn to the Psalms. To use silence as praise is a really lovely just phrase from the Psalms. To use silence as praise. There are also certain songs or prayers that are part of our liturgy, and one of them is from Psalm 16, Shaviti Adonai lenegdi tamid. I have set God before me always. And this Shaviti, I've set God before me always, can be used, it's actually, you can buy or make yourself like a picture with these Hebrew letters on it that people use as a focus to keep their concentration as they're praying, for example. Or you could use it as you're meditating, like to put in front of you, and with an open-eyed meditation, gaze at the Shaviti. That's what it's called, the whole plaque, or I don't know what you call it, diagram?
Mandala?
It's like a mandala, only it's just Hebrew letters. But yes, thank you, it's like a mandala. So you could meditate with your eyes open, just gazing at it. Or, here's another, to take it literally, I've set God before me always. This is the Hebrew letters of our understanding of God's most holy name. And we don't pronounce we don't try to say this, but we read it. It's written in the scriptures. And so this is literally, I place God before me always. Like to have, I once made these for our meditation class, so people could just sit and meditate and look at this, as you say, like a mandala, like a visual and an external image. For those of us who know Hebrew, and I've done this, and it's just like, it's almost so powerful I can't like do it regularly because it's just like, yikes, is to visualize these letters. And it's actually a little of Abulafia, I just realized, I never thought about it like this. Like I play with the letters a little bit. I mean, they're not static, they're like floating, and I float around them, and so that's Jewish meditation. The other thing about Jewish meditation is that from the teachers and from the books that are available, is that there's a lot of God talk. Now, when I teach meditation, I don't assume that that's going to be meaningful to everybody. So, I mean, I'll do something like this, but there are those teachers who really talk about coming into relationship with God somehow, like our mystics did. And I'm just mentioning that because as I go through my books, as I was reviewing some books thinking about tonight, I was struck by how many of them talk about the God aspect as if this were somehow prayer, which I do believe it is. For me, it is prayer, but it's in a like a wordless kind of prayer, not a well, I don't know how else to say that. There is a rabbi in this country, his name is Jonathan Slater, who is a conservative rabbi who has studied Vipassana meditation for 10 or 12 years. And I've known him during that whole time because we went through a program together, a spirituality program together that stressed meditation. And what Jonathan does these days is take the week's Torah portion, as we're reading through the 5 books of Moses, and translates a teaching from the Hasidic tradition. Right, so the Hasidic tradition is very psychologically oriented, which is why we love it. It's why it has a resurgence, because those teachers really look at how it speaks to us as human beings rather than, I don't know. Anyway, it's very, as I say, psychologically oriented, these teachings, over a period of about 150 years. And Jonathan will take one teacher and translate a teaching per week that has to do with that week's Torah portion that we're reading. And then he gives his own take on it based on his insights into Vipassana meditation. And it's just great, because on the one hand you get the very traditional interpretation of the Torah portion, but then with a psychological twist. And then you get Jonathan's take, which is meditation, mindfulness meditation, based on the theme of the text. I have an example for you to try to make this real for you. Just to say that there are, I don't know how many of us in the country who get these emails once a week. I study them in partnership with a colleague of mine who lives in San Diego. We get on Skype, right? And we look at each other and we study Torah together once a week. And I don't even know how many other people are on this email list, but I would guess probably at least 100. So if you think about 100 rabbis and educators and cantors doing this every week, it's like top down, if you excuse the expression. That this is beginning to, I hope, have an impact on all of our congregations, slowly. Anyway, this is what Jonathan said about God in one of these things. He referred to, as meditation takes us like descent into the chariot. Remember we talked about the descent into the Merkabah? That the descent that comes from meditation is, as he says, finding God, that is, the ultimate depth of one's being. And I find that a very helpful way of thinking about God. It's not like God, but that we somehow encounter the divine chariot, the divine, in the ultimate depth of our being through meditation. I actually think that's true. Do any of you feel that is your experience? A couple of head nods, a couple like, I'm not sure, not yet, maybe, I hope, someday. So, who are the Jewish meditation teachers? They're mostly rabbis, some educators. There's this particular program that I alluded to, the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, whose aim was to bring spirituality into Jewish life, about which I'll say more in just a few minutes. And first, a cohort of rabbis that I went through along with Rabbi Slater. And then there was cohorts for cantors, who are the ones who provide the music for us in our services, and then a cohort for educators. So we tend to be the ones who are teaching Jewish meditation. Just to mention that, I don't know. So I want to give an example of a text, something that Jonathan did. I just thought this was so fabulous. I'll see if I can convey it to you. So there's a concept in Judaism called teshuvah. Some of you I know are Jewish and you know what teshuvah is. Teshuvah is the word that's used when we talk about the High Holy Days, which means repentance. We often translate it as repentance. So during the High Holy Days, it's a time of soul searching, of reviewing our past year, of seeing where we've made mistakes, where we lost track, missed the mark, repairing what we can, and especially during those 10 days of the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we talk a lot about teshuvah, or repentance, for those ways that we've gone astray or made mistakes. I hope you notice I didn't use the word sin. We don't like that word. It's really not a Jewish word. So. Okay, so that's teshuvah. And but it literally means return. Return. That's literally what it means. So we use it in the High Holy Days as like return to your true self. And this is what Jonathan did just the other week. It was a text about teshuvah in the traditional sense. And then when he talks about meditation, he says this. As we're meditating and we kind of come back, you know how your thoughts wander and then you come back, he says that is teshuvah, in the sense of returning our attention to the point of focus and regaining some inner balance. You see, it's just so brilliant to use that concept of teshuvah as meditation. So every time that you go, oh, I was thinking about dinner, and you bring yourself back, you're doing this holy act of teshuvah. And by saying this, he gives us such a permission, oh, teshuvah once again, yay, because it has this context of a very holy time in our liturgical year. So that's a really good example of the most mature form of Jewish meditation teaching that I'm aware of right now. Okay, I think that was pretty much what I wanted to say about, let me see how we're doing, good, about Jewish meditation as I know it today. One other thing to mention is that in the late 90s and in the first half of the 2000s, I taught Jewish meditation, fairly often. People were interested. It has not come up as a request at all in the last, since I've been here in Tucson. I taught a course of Jewish meditation when I first came, and it was nicely attended. 15 people came from a fairly large congregation. That was a good turnout. And then one other course I taught at St. Philip's with a friend of mine who's a priest there, called Meditation as Prayer, which I do believe it is. And that was nicely attended, and that was about 4 years ago. And since then, I'm not feeling the energy around it that there was for probably 10 or 15 years. Yeah.
Could that be connected with why so many Jews find Buddhism as their place to meditate?
Let me go to that then, because that was really next, was what has drawn Jews to Buddhism. So, historical, in the 60s, as I alluded to, what happened was, after World War II, and I think it probably happened in other denominations as well, but it was certainly true in Judaism, that the Jewish people were really reeling from that experience. And the Judaism of the 50s, right after World War II, was really pretty dry, pretty by the book. And by the time the 60s, so those would be boomers coming of age, the whole 60s thing, that generation wanted more, wanted some juice, and they weren't finding it in Jewish synagogues, any of them across the whole spectrum. And Judaism was more interested, I think, Reform Judaism, in rebuilding community and moving to the suburbs, and social action. So in the 50s and 60s, the rallying cry for Reform Jews, which were easily a third of the Jews in this country, was social action, civil rights, those kinds of things. And that was external. That was all well and good. It's important, but it didn't satisfy the inner desire of the heart for something what we call spirituality. I'm not going to try to define it. You all know sort of what it is. You wouldn't be here if you didn't know what that yearning was. So that was one thing that was happening. It was just a cultural thing. It was happening in our society. The interest in the East, that the old ways weren't satisfying, and a desire for a more personal expression of one's inner life. And there was a lack of Jewish knowledge. That is, both the teachers, the rabbis at that time, and the congregants really didn't know, mostly, I would assert, the history that I just gave you. That meditation was a part of our history, that spirituality really was available in Judaism, but it was pretty still underground. And so there was just sort of a general lack of knowledge of ways that one could enter Jewish life spiritually. For example, through the holidays, through Shabbat, through study. These are all ways that we talk about through rituals that open us up to some wider experience of community, of the divine, of the meaning of life, all the things that we, like what's my role in the cosmos, really is available to us through those things if you know to look for them. Okay. But mostly we didn't know to look for them. The other thing was that liberal Judaism was really out of balance, I would say. That it was heady, it was intellectual, it was rational. And Reform Judaism, again, had thrown out the baby with the bathwater. And I mean that almost literally. It's a cliche, but that ritual was considered old-fashioned, was a little bit embarrassing. That's what our grandparents did. And so in the 50s, what might have been meaningful rituals were also abandoned. And what was left was rationality and social action. And that's out of balance. There was not a nurturing of the heart. Yeah.
Don't you think that there was a desire to assimilate after World War II,
Oh, yeah.
which made many Jews say, okay, let's get rid of all this tradition so that we can just fit in with everybody else and not have anything like the Holocaust ever happen to us?
Yes, so assimilation definitely, and fitting in and spending our energy making it in this culture, which is a very, the material pursuit. Absolutely, absolutely. So let me just say two other things about this. I really think these are all really explain the appeal of meditation and Eastern religions to the Jews of the 60s and 70s. Buddhism does not have, as you all know, a theology, a God concept. That makes it very appealing. You can still be Jewish, whatever your theology is, and embrace Buddhism without somehow abandoning Judaism, or even abandoning whatever, I just use the word theology that you might have. There's not a conflict. Mm-hmm. To move from Judaism to Christianity, any form of Christianity, presents a very serious theological conflict. But moving to Buddhism, that's where the term Jew-boo came from. It's not my favorite Jew-boo. Oh, you don't know this?
I thought it was Judish.
Buddhish, yeah. Jew-boo. Yeah. Yeah. So, there wasn't like a conflict, and you could be Jewish and not give up, you could be Buddhist and not give up your Jewish identity. One of the reasons for that is that Judaism is more than a religion. It really is, as any of you know, if you're not Jewish, but you know Jewish friends who are Jewish, it really is a way of life. It's a whole identity. Not just cultural, not just bagels, but really a worldview, a sense of identity with the Jewish people across time and space. When I think about it, when I light candles on Friday night on Shabbat, Jews all over the world, like my people all over the world, are lighting. They're doing the same thing. Or actually, what I picture is, how as the globe turns like that, that the lights go on. It's like a wave of candles being lit all over the globe. So, being Jewish is more than just going to synagogue. Much, much, much more. And so one can go to the Zendo, which I actually do on Saturday mornings when I'm not teaching or doing something, in services, and still feel very Jewish. So the one thing I would like to say about that, though, that I said I'd come back to that, here's how I be at the Zendo and stay Jewish, like really consciously Jewish. There are two things that happen at the end of the sit. There's a chant. You'll have to help me with this. It's so this is the thing. I don't vow or bow, or bow and vow. So what I mean by that is there's a chant at the end that says the Dharma gates are numberless, endless. Dharma gates are
the four vows.
The four vows.
Common to all Buddhist traditions.
The four vows. Okay, yeah. I'm just remembering the first one. Yeah, they're four, and then you repeat them. You say them 3 times. Dharma gates are endless. Can't remember the word. I vow to enter them.
The Buddha way is unsurpassed. I vow to embody.
Yes. Greed, hate, and delusion.
Rise endlessly.
I vow to. Oh, yeah. So there are four of these. It's very strong in the Jewish tradition not to take a vow. It's really strong in the rabbinic tradition that we don't take a vow. It's considered like you're promising God. And the word vow, I mean, there's a Hebrew word, but in English it's a vow. I don't make vows. I don't even make promises. I'll say, I hope to meet you for lunch next week. I never say I promise. Who knows, you know? So I certainly wouldn't take a vow. So when they're chanting this, I don't. And then everyone stands up and bows, gets down on their knees 3 times. You know, does 3 bows, half prostrations. And I don't do those either, because it's another thing in Judaism, is that we don't bow to anybody or anything but God. So when this is happening, and the Zen folks are fine with it. I mean, they don't, you know, which is great. But it's my way of saying, I'm a Jew in this setting. I love being in this setting. I love the meditation. But this far I can't go. I don't take vows and I don't bow. So that's just to give you a flavor of how one, or a sense of how, at least for this person, I'm fully Jewish in a non-Jewish setting, and very comfortable with it.
Well, you know, I think people from other traditions too initially might have difficulty with the vows because of different reasons. You know, how you interpret them.
Yes.
Like the first vow is the many beings are numberless. I vow to save them.
Save them, yes.
But that's a translation, of course, from the
Yes.
original, you know, Pali, actually. And so it doesn't mean to save people. But if you're coming from a Christian tradition, for example, it sounds like you're supposed to save people.
Them, yes.
You know, so
Yes.
so a lot of people have difficulty with that one. You know, but you can use each of the vows as like a koan or a meditation in itself. In fact, I don't know if people are familiar with koan study, but eventually, once you get through all the other koans, you do take up the vows and some of the other, you know, the sutras as koans and as meditations in themselves. So they're not vows in the sense that they're absolute. You know, they're how you inform your
I
life
understand that.
in the world every day. You know, with bringing these elements into your.
No, I understand that, since they're
practice in a
impossible
way.
by
Yeah.
definition. No, I understand that,
Yeah.
but I'm just saying, like, for
Right,
me,
sure.
I just wanted to say, but thank you for that, yes. I wanted to just mention that Judaism has responded to this wave of Jews who went to Buddhism in the 60s and 70s. The Zen Center in San Francisco was run by Jews when I got there. Like all of the abbots, almost all of them were Jewish. I think that's, and the founders of Spirit Rock and of the Sharon Salzberg, you know, I mean, it's Joseph Goldstein, yeah. So, but what's happened, I think that's changing. I just wanted to mention that Judaism has responded, and with meditation, with new kinds of music, with new adult education. Just to say that I think one of the reasons that meditation is no longer such a hot topic for Jews, perhaps, is that we have found other ways to nurture that desire for a deeper personal spiritual life. And perhaps there's a trend to find fulfillment within Judaism and to use meditation as a part of that. So we have about 5 minutes, a few minutes left. Yes, please.
Yeah. Are there any meditative practices associated with the 10 Sephiroth in the Kabbalistic tradition?
Yes.
I'm
You have to.
Could you say the question?
Yes,
Yeah.
and I'll rephrase it also. So the Kabbalistic tradition, the Kabbalah describes the overflowing of the divine energy into the world as we know it now, the physical world, through 10. Maybe you've seen the schema of 10 circles. It's called the tree of life, or the Sfirot. Mm-hmm. And he's asking whether there are any meditation practices associated with these 10 practices. Mm-hmm. And indeed there are. Of course there are. Now you want me to tell you what they are?
Well, not every single one, but anything that might be relevant to this group or in a general way that might, be insightful?
What I would say is that actually Kabbalah is a very sophisticated and very esoteric system, and any attempts to popularize it does a disservice to it. So I've made it a principle not to teach Kabbalah. I've studied it, but I just think but I'll say this about it, that each of these just the notion, how do you represent nothing turning into something? How do you represent that? It's like the basic question of life. Like there was nothing and then there's us. There's the universe. And the Kabbalists attempt to answer that question. It's the other, remember I said about the Maaseh Merkava, the works of the chariot. The other big place of Jewish mystical exploration is Maaseh Bereshit, is the works of creation. They attempt to address this very question from the beginning, because that is the question. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. From what? So this is a schema. It's just totally symbolic as a way of trying to talk about what were those building blocks that ended up at the bottom circle here in the physical world as we know it. Each of those circles has a characteristic associated with it. And if one wanted to, and we happen to be in a period right now, the county of the Omer, for 7 weeks we look at a week at a time at the 7 bottom of these 10 spheres, and each one is associated with a characteristic. We're right now in the one called Hod, which means beauty. So if you wanted to have like a focus for your meditation, you might just sit with the word Hod or beauty and just see what arises around that. That would be an example of how you could use the spherot to meditate.
So when you teach meditation, do you say that a Jewish meditation, do you say that there's a goal for that meditation?
No more than you would say. I don't have a goal. Do you all have goals? If you do, you're in trouble. Yeah, it's not any different than the reason for me. The one thing that might be different from someone doing Buddhist meditation is that I do think of meditation as prayer. And it might be that some of us would take up meditation as an alternative to a more formal, wordy prayer practice. So I'll give you an example from that. I had a really rough time with one of my kids. Any of you ever have a rough time with a kid? Like I was just really upset and didn't know what to do. And there was nothing I could do, actually. Everything turned out, but it took a while. And so for about 6 months, my meditation was from one of the Psalms, which was Min ha-metzar karataya, aneni b'mirchavya. From a narrow place I called on God. God answered from a wide expanse. And that was my meditation. I was in a narrow place, and I was hoping to find a way to be in a wide place. And I use my meditation practice to do that. It only works if you already have a meditation practice. If someone came to me and said, I have this terrible thing happening in my life, what should I do? I would not say, start meditating with this verse from the Psalms. Maybe, but I probably wouldn't couch it as meditation, because one has to learn how to meditate. I might couch it in the language of prayer. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Do you know of any of the esoteric kind of one-to-one, one-to-two person traditions that you talked about? Does any of that survive? None of it?
Only the fact that it says in the sources, in the Mishnah, which was written in the year 200 or so, there's certain things you can only speak in the presence of 3, and other things you can only speak in the presence of 2. And it doesn't tell you what, and it doesn't tell you who the 2 are. Whether it's 2 teachers, a teacher and a student, it doesn't say. We don't know. Don't we wish we did?
So I had a question similar to John's.
Yeah.
That in Buddhism, there's a lot of debate about what the word enlightenment means, but there's kind of a general agreement of moving towards that. people disagree
Yes.
on what realizations about the nature of self and reality, but
Yes.
I was wondering if in Judaism there's some sort of ultimate goal, or in Buddhism there's often levels of enlightenment, stages of it, if there's anything like that.
Yes, thank you. That is what I understand now. Not really that I'm aware of. Not really. I mean, the esoteric tradition, the history that I gave you, definitely that's where they were going, like as fast as they could, I think. But contemporary Jewish meditation really is based on Vipassana and Metta, in my experience of the meditation teachers I know. And those are just like insight, like how to live a better life, a more aware life, just awareness of body sensations, awareness of mental states, so that we live clearer lives, so that we respond more appropriately. This is Jonathan Slater's language. He would talk about, so we respond more appropriately to things that come to us, and that we're not knocked off our course so much. That really is what I understand Jewish meditation these days to be about. Not about those levels, the Merkava, the chariot, the stages that I know that Buddhists sometimes talk about. Yeah.
How would that map onto, at least in the Hasidic world, the idea of a tzaddik, of a righteous one, who seems to me like an enlightened being, which seems, from what I've seen, to kind of something that happens, but it's not set up as this goal to like work towards. Though I did hear recently more of the concept of a ben oni, which is someone who does kind of move that way and isn't just kind of born into this fate.
Yeah.
I don't know, how much does that kind of idea translate into modern secular liberal Judaism?
like that's sort of sudden enlightenment, like the tzaddik is suddenly, I don't know, but what comes to my mind is these teachings that I was talking about, that Jonathan translates, are all about, this year especially, about how to be a tzaddik. And it's really about your actions, your deeds. It's not so inward. It's more, the tzaddik is, studies and does the mitzvot, and observes Jewish law, and is an exemplar human being, or an exemplar. And is somehow closer to God because of that, and in the Hasidic, only in the Hasidic world, is somehow an intermediary. This is very not Jewish, except it is Jewish. The idea of having an intermediary between an individual and God. And the tzaddik had that role. But as far as it being meditative, the one, since you seem to know something about this, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who was a very famous, probably bipolar Hasidic teacher, taught his students to go, it's a certain technique that other people teach, but his teaching is very well known now, taught his students to go out into the field every day and speak aloud to God. So where no one could hear you, so you were totally free, and to cry your heart out. And if you didn't know how to start, you would say, I don't know how to start. God, I don't even know if you're there. And just start. And that is a kind of a meditation practice too, I believe. That's the practice I know that he taught. But as the tzaddik, as somehow a roshi, it's different. That's my sense of it.
So, Chris, you take that the last question?
Last question, okay.
Yeah. Well, I don't quite know how to phrase the question, but I wanted to hear a little bit more on the risky dynamic of the monotheistic faith visiting the non-theistic technique, and you have outlined very well how you can retain the theistic aspects and still study the technique, but surely there's a risk. There's just as big a dynamic, a risk of people saying, this works really well, what do I need God for?
Oh yeah, or what do I need Judaism for?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Not just God. I mean,
well, yeah.
There are many Jews of my acquaintance who don't have like a strong traditional God concept, but feel very strongly Jewish.
Was that driven more by what you outlined in the 60s, 70s, 80s of enormous attraction to social justice, or was that just losing track of deity in contemplation. I mean, it sounds like there's a 1-2 punch. We can have justice, and we don't need religion for that. We can do Buddhism and justice and be virtuous people. And yet you have outlined a really great way where the dynamic can pull people back into their faith of origin. Mm-hmm. What's the risk? How do they get torn out of it?
See, if by risk you means, we might lose someone?
Yes! Well, lose Judaism. Oops.
Oh. I don't worry about that. We've been around long enough. I really don't. I mean, it hurts me when someone leaves. I feel like, personally, like a little, like, hair has been pulled out of my, I mean, I feel it personally. But I take the long view that people will find what's meaningful to them. If you build it, they will come. And if what we have to offer isn't satisfying, then oh well, maybe it's not going to survive. I really do feel that, we do the best we can within the Jewish tradition, as I know other traditions do. This is the best. We're offering things that will hopefully be meaningful to 21st century Jews. And if it's not, but God is not at the heart of that. I mean, that's the thing, and some of the Jews in the room are nodding their heads. God is not at the heart of that, and that's a whole other very big conversation.